I'm Professor Sharon Bessel from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. The Individual Deprivation Measure is an individual measure of multidimensional poverty, which is sensitive to gender and able to identify which social groups are affected by poverty and how. It assesses multidimensional poverty across 15 dimensions. Education is one of the dimensions of the IDM. In 2018, a research team from the Australian National University, working with an Indonesian survey organisation, SurveyMeter, undertook an IDM study in South Sulawesi in Indonesia. We surveyed over 5,600 women and men over the age of 16 years. The deep and nuanced insights provided by the IDM study in Indonesia provide important information for policies, programs and services aiming to address poverty. The findings of the IDM study show that Indonesia has made great progress in access to basic services, particularly education. But there are some groups for whom access remains a problem. Even more strikingly, while access has improved steadily over time, the quality of basic services remains a problem. It is quality that must now be addressed if people are to move out of poverty. Let's take a look at the Idm Dimension of Education as an example. The IDM does not assess education based on enrolment rates or expected years schooling, which indicate current access amongst young people. This is crucially important in understanding progress in access, but it does not tell us enough about the nexus between poverty and education across all age and social groups. The IDM takes a different approach. It assesses the level of education attended and the outcomes in terms of functional literacy and numeracy. Let's take a look at some of the findings. Indonesia is recognised internationally for the progress made towards basic education for all. There is now almost universal access to 9 years basic education with parity between boys and girls. But despite this improvement, our study found that across the adult population, levels of education remain low. Of course, this is to be expected. Older people did not have access to education as children to the extent that children do today. But these low levels of education have wide-reaching implications for people's lives and opportunities, for the way people experience poverty, and for communities and for national development. In the district of Jeneponto, 21% of IDM survey respondents reported having no schooling. Only 3.6% of young people between the age of 16 and 24 reported having no schooling. Almost 3/4 had attended secondary school. But in the middle-age cohort, 1 in 5 people reported having no schooling, and for the 60-plus age group, over 40% had never been to school. People living with a disability were twice as likely to have never been to school. But for those who do attend school, what are the outcomes? Low levels of education have implications for how we respond to multidimensional poverty. But the outcomes of education are even more important. If education is to achieve its promise of improving people's lives and creating opportunities, it must deliver good learning outcomes for individuals. In Jeneponto, over 98% of people who had attended secondary school were able to read a simple sentence. But 37% of people who reported attending only primary school could not read. And what about writing? Almost 90% of people who had attended only primary school could not write. 63% of people who reported attending secondary school were not able to write. And most worryingly, over half of those who reported attending some level of tertiary education were not able to write legibly or accurately. The IDM also assesses numeracy based on responses to 2 simple equations, one focusing on addition and subtraction and one based on multiplication and division. If we look only at those individuals who reported attending secondary school, just over 12% of people were not able to correctly answer the addition and subtraction question. The findings were more worrying in relation to multiplication and division. Over 42% of people who had attended secondary school were unable to correctly answer a straightforward multiplication and division question. More than 20% of people who had attended tertiary education were unable to correctly answer the multiplication and division question. Outcomes were consistently worse in rural and especially in remote areas, and for older women. There are two key messages here. First, attending school does not necessarily produce anticipated outcomes in terms of basic literacy and numeracy. Indonesia's success in providing access to education is impressive, but the outcomes in terms of literacy and numeracy are not good. If schooling is to provide people with the skills and knowledge they need to move out of poverty, then the quality of education must improve. Second, in assessing the nexus between multidimensional poverty and education, it is important to focus not only on access, but on outcomes. And it is important to assess outcomes at the individual level. It's only by assessing what education delivers for individuals that we can know which social groups are most deprived. From the IDM Findings, we can see that people living with a disability, older women, and people living in rural and especially remote areas were more deprived in regard to education. Here, we've looked only at education, which is widely considered as one dimension of multidimensional poverty, and it is one of the 15 dimensions of the IDM. And we can see that it is essential to assess not only access, but to go beyond and assess quality and outcomes. It's not only information about access to basic services, but information about quality, reliability, and outcomes that is essential if people living in poverty are to be better supported and if poverty is to be effectively addressed.